Good evening. We come to our final session of the day. One of the very first pamphlets I edited at the Centre for Policy Studies was titled, "What is a Conservative?" written by the great Paul Johnson. It concluded, "Recently, I sat at lunch next to a lady who had been married all her life to a Conservative peer. She told me that there were three things she would never change under any circumstances: her nationality, her religion, and her Conservative allegiance. I asked her to define conservatism. She replied, 'That is a question no true Conservative should ever be expected to answer.' Which puts our final panelists in a difficult position, for we are indeed going to ask them, what does it mean to be a Conservative? Roger.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious that this is the last gathering of a very long day. I can see the exhaustion written on your faces and also the expectation of a drink shortly afterwards. So I will try not to go over the 1/4 mark by more than a couple of minutes or so, but we have a very distinguished and interesting panel, so it would be a shame to waste the opportunity. Charles Moore is known, of course, to you all for his distinguished career, has already spoken to us today in a very impressive way, but now I'm going to challenge him to say more abstract things than he said this morning. Rich Lowry is the editor of National Review, who has made that journal into a voice of American conservatism, expressly addressed to the rising generation who are more in need than us oldies of a substantial system of belief, because, as you know, our enemies have deprived us of that. Finally, there will be Michael Gove, who, of course, is known to everybody as our Minister of Education, who has been perhaps the bravest Minister of Education in my lifetime, which isn't saying very much, but nevertheless, he has done amazingly well, as you know from the fact that he's so widely hated by all the people whom you hate. So, the question we have to discuss is just what is a conservative and what are the fundamental items of belief or attitude or whatever you want to call it that we share, that brings us together in the alliance that we all feel we belong to, and which might inspire us again to fight back against what has been happening to us in the last few decades. And I shall ask each of my three speakers to speak in turn. Charles, I'd like to speak first, addressing the question perhaps from an English point of view, or British point of view, and then Rich from the American point of view, and Michael from the point of view of someone who's engaged in politics in the new situation that has developed in the last 10 years. So, Charles, if you'd like to speak for 3 minutes to this theme, we can then get the discussion going.
Well, thank you, Roger. When my brother was about 7, I said, "Do you like pizza?" to him, and he said, "No, what is it?" That seems to me a fundamental conservative reaction. That's how you start. First of all, you are suspicious of the new thing, and second, you want to know more about it. And there is a tension within conservatism between suspicion of what may happen and an odd openness. I was reading this book by Chesterton today, and I came across this sentence this afternoon. "And every truth a man has found out as a man of science is always subtly different from any truth he has found out as a man, because a man's family, friends, habits, and social type have always got well underway before he has thoroughly learned the theory of anything." So I think all conservatives would start from that position, that the really important stuff came before the theory. But this creates a tension within conservatism between the sort of quietist mode and the activist mode. And you see that in the life of Margaret Thatcher, because it seems to me that you could never call her a quietist, but until 1974, she basically thought that everything was all right so long as there was a Tory government. And she followed an essentially conventional career until that point. And then she came to realize that that sort of automatic quality by which conservatism would do all right had failed. And the great insight she had of that time was that it was actually failing. Her party was failing, its ideas were failing, the beliefs appeared to be failing, and the country was failing. And she saw the immense importance of turning what might normally be quite gentle, quiet doctrines into something much more active and something much more resistant to enemies, because they were confronted with enemies. And that's doesn't come naturally to all conservatives, and it's partly why conservatives split in the 1930s about appeasement, with some people wanting to give in to, appease Hitler, and others wanting a more active policy. And the appeasers in conservatism were more numerous than the more active. So where are we now, after the period when Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher went on the front foot? She said in the Bruges speech, "For the first time in my lifetime, freedom is on the offensive." Very important change of attitude for a conservative, about that freedom would be moving forward rather than something which one had to defend against further encroachments, actually moving forward. And that wouldn't be so true today. And I would like to argue that in the modern world, with global ideologies flying around, and I'm very glad John Howard mentioned Islamism as one of them, that the conservative disposition should err on the active side that Margaret Thatcher put forward, rather than the gentler, quieter side, which I very much like, but which I think is inadequate to the circumstances of the time. That also goes to the point that John Howard made, which is that you mustn't get embarrassed about the basic set of beliefs you have. You mustn't accept the premises of the other side. You can be confident in your own premises, because they are the premises that are reflected by your experience of life, rather than by the imposition of theory. That's where, in the 21st century, we should start, and on which we should revive. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. I'll now ask Rich Lowry to speak to the same point.
Thank you, Roger. It's a pleasure for me to be here today, and I think one of the implicit points of including so many Americans in the program is that there's a shared Anglo-American interest in advancing the ideals of Margaret Thatcher. But I don't want to put a damper on the spirit and on this panel right from the beginning, but I will say there are certain national differences that are unbridgeable, and it's only when you're an American and you come and sit on a panel at a conference in Britain that you feel a little out of step, because you've never expressed a view on fox hunting, let alone written passionate and philosophically profound defenses of it, as Charles and Roger have. So please forgive me, gentlemen, but it's an honor to be on such a distinguished panel, and I must confess, I do not know every in and out of Michael's battles. All I know is that he's been denounced by the National Union of Teachers, and for me, that's enough for you to live forever in my esteem, Michael. So I don't know how American my initial thoughts are here. I like to think of them more as universal and timeless, but just a few thoughts. I think the fundamental conservative attitudes, if we get to the bottom of things, are modesty, gratitude, reverence, and joy. And I'll just hit on all those extremely briefly. Modesty, obviously we have a modest view of what you can do to change society, and a modesty about how much we know when it comes to changing society. This is a Hayekian concept, right? That planners don't know enough to plan an economy, and that we should have respect for tradition as this great expression of the collective wisdom of human generations across time, that one person at one given time, or one sect at one faction at one given time, is not going to know enough to overturn thoughtlessly. And then there's gratitude. Conservatives realize how much we have been given undeservedly. What have any of us done to deserve Michelangelo, or Rembrandt, or Twain, or Beethoven, or Dickens? Who of us helped build this place? Who of us had any role in creating parliamentary supremacy or drafting the Declaration of Independence or sussing out the American Constitution? All of those things are gifts to us that we did nothing to deserve. You know, a Christian is supposed to rejoice in and be humbled by the great gift of unearned grace. Well, a conservative has that attitude towards our civilization. And my colleague, Yuval Levin, wrote a book recently on Burke and Paine, and he argued that you can see in Burke and Paine the beginnings of the modern right and the modern left. And he points out that you see in the images they use, two images come up constantly. Paine talks about government as an instrument of progress, a way to forge advance. Burke talks about the constitutional system as creating space for private activity and private initiative. And that's where the joy comes in, because conservatives realize it is in that space that the truly important things happen. And nothing can match the satisfactions of that space, of friends, of family, of faith, of enterprise. So we should be joyful. Let the left be dour and humorless. Let the left try to smooth out all of society and create a deadening uniformity. Let the left hold true to one of the worst slogans of all time and a truly noxious thought that the personal is political. Let us do the opposite. And in a spirit of collegiality, let me say, let the damn foxes beware. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Now, Michael, to conclude.
I was recently in the United States, and I had the great privilege of hearing Governor Chris Christie speak. And Governor Christie was explaining a particular moment in his recent re-election campaign, when he went to visit a town where he'd secured only 3% of the vote in the previous election. And when he arrived in the town, there was a protest from the registered Democrats who didn't want him there. He was interrupted by the local media, and the reporter, just as he was attempting to address this town hall meeting, said, Governor Christie, you're not wanted here. You are such a divisive figure. And he said, divisive? 97% of people in this town didn't vote for me. Have they ever agreed on anything so much, so unanimously? And the reason I mention that is that I feel something similar when I'm accused of being divisive by the National Union of Teachers. I think that the NUT have never been so united as when they've had to contemplate what I'm doing. But one of the reasons why I stress the importance of unity is that there can sometimes be, and both Rich and Charles alluded to it, a vociferous tendency within conservatives. There can sometimes be a tendency, which we find in my own countrymen in Scotland, of trying to specify that you have to be purer than pure in order to fit into the narrow terms of the conventicle. And I, even though I'm a proud Scot, think that we should take an Anglican approach towards conservatism. We should recognise that you can simultaneously be a Whig and in the Tory party. You can be a Manchester Liberal and a modern Conservative, in the same way as you can simultaneously have worshipping in the same Anglican church someone who believes themselves to be a Catholic and someone who believes themselves to be a Protestant. And the reason why I think that we need to be so broad is because the conservative tradition is nourished by and irrigated by many rivers and currents of thought. And I'll just mention three in the time that we have left with reference to three particular thinkers. The first, of course, is Edmund Burke. I think the most important thing that Edmund Burke pointed out, and the many beautiful things and important things he said, is that society is a contract between the dead, the living, and those yet to be born. And the reason why that's important is that none of us, in his own words, can trade upon our own private stock of reason. We all benefit from the thoughts, the customs, the habits, the practices, and the insights of those who've come before. And when we think, for example, of debates over English literature, insights into human nature, appreciations of what it is to empathize with others, are encoded and included in the novels that have been written by great writers of the past far more effectively than any of us could derive from our own experience in our own lifetimes. And the same applies, of course, to political institutions even more powerfully. It is a great tradition which we inherit that allows us to build something perhaps even better for the next generation. And the other thing I should stress about the debt that we owe to the next generation is that we must not squander this planet. its natural resources, or indeed run up unsustainable budget deficits, because that is essentially stealing from our children. And that's a totally unconservative approach. Second thing I would say is, to quote another thinker, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. Conservatives like the quirky. They appreciate the local. They understand that diversity, proper diversity, means acknowledging that things will be different in different parts of your country and different parts of your political realm. Those who want uniformity are those who are the enemy of the human spirit in all its creativity. So those who say that all schools must be a particular model of comprehensive, that all forms of government within a nation state have to be exactly the same, they're unconservative because what they don't respect is the right of individual communities and individual traditions to have the institutions that suit them and which give expression to their sense of belonging. And the final thing that I would say is, to quote another thinker, the Conservative Party is a national party or it is nothing. There are some Conservatives who don't believe in nation states. I remember being at a debate in the Oxford Union when Professor Roger Scruton pointed out that actually the Habsburg Empire was a lot more successful than many of the nation states in the Balkans and had kept the peace for longer than those nation states. But I respectfully, perhaps for the first and only time in my life, disagree with Roger and disagree with those Conservatives like Eli Kaduri who were enemies of nationalism. I think that nation states are the best way in which all of us can ensure that the rule of law, which we rely on for our security and for our liberty, that representative popular democracy and that social solidarity can all be held together in a satisfying and meaningful way, which allows us to have an emotional focus for our loyalty, but also to make sacrifices for our fellow man and woman. So I think those are the three most important things about conservatism: a recognition of the debt we owe to the past and the debt that we owe to our children, a recognition that the quirky and the idiosyncratic is an essential part of human nature and that which makes anything successful, and of course the fact that the nation state has been the most satisfying political unit ever devised by man for the exercise of power.
Well, as I anticipated, that was a tour de force, Michael, and there is not a great deal of disagreement on the panel. One thing that I think I would like to do just to get a conversation going, and before you start having recourse to your iPads when you can ask questions through them apparently, one thing I'd like to do is to ask the opinion of the three panelists on a peculiar fact, which is that parties declare themselves to be conservative either in their name or in their beliefs and win elections on that declaration only in those countries which belong to the Anglosphere. This is a very weird fact, but I think it is a fact. There is something that we share which makes it perfectly reasonable for us to say, when questioned as to our political beliefs, that we are conservatives. I know very well from my experience of the rest of Europe that this is something which people, even if they will be forced to admit it under pressure, won't come forward with spontaneously. And I wonder whether anybody has a view as to why this might be so.
Well, isn't it that it's not possible in modern continental society, for the most part, to be proud of your political tradition if you go back at all far? So you can't. And that's less true, obviously, in Scandinavia or the Netherlands, but it's true in France or, for other reasons, in Germany. Isn't that right? That you can't sort of look around the equivalent of Guildhall and see the equivalent statues and draw the equivalent lessons. Isn't that how?
What do you think,
well,
Richard?
I can speak to the American experience on this. It's a wonderful thing being a traditionalist in America because the tradition is so vital and so constantly alive. You look at just the Declaration of Independence. It has been used over and over again in American history as an engine to force more justice and to force change. You look at slavery. One of Abraham Lincoln's main rhetorical tools against slavery was the Declaration, and basically challenging the Democrats and saying, well, you can have the Declaration of Independence written by your hero Thomas Jefferson, or you can have slavery. And that's the contradiction you're caught on. And he would say things in the 1850s that were suffused with a profound sense of loss, because he thought we'd lost touch with those ideals. He'd say things like, our Republican robe is soiled and trailed in the dust. Let us renew it and wash it white in the spirit, if not the blood, of the American Revolution. So that's the fundamental conservative project in America. It's forging progress through a return to those ideals and applying them to the circumstances of the day. Another famous example, of course, would be the Civil Rights Movement, where Martin Luther King talks of the Declaration and the Constitution as promissory notes that should be cashed for all Americans. And there's this Lincoln called the Declaration this electric cord that all Americans can touch and have access to. And that is what's it's most exciting and vital about the American tradition and makes conservatism so strong in America.
Margaret, do you have anything to add to that? Or?
Just one reflection. I hesitate to take issue, but our two sister parties in Australia and New Zealand, which are identifiably right of centre, are called the Liberal and the National Party. It's the Canadians who call themselves Conservative, and I think not for the first time we should celebrate the bravery of the Canadians. The nation, I think, is probably closest to us in so many ways, and having the only other party that I can think of which is electorally successful and unashamedly conservative in its name. More broadly, I think it is the case that you do have in some other nations identifiable conservative traditions which are not exactly ours, but which we should recognize. So, for example, in France, I think you certainly have a Gaullist tradition, whatever the party is called, whether it's the RPR or the UMP or whatever, and that is a distinctive vision of French conservatism. It's also the case in Poland, another great country. You have two identifiably conservative parties. One in government, one is the principal opposition. And I think it reinforces my point about, or I hope it reinforces my point, about recognizing that as conservatives, we appreciate that there are different political traditions in different jurisdictions. I can understand entirely why Christian democracy is the right approach towards small c conservatism in Germany, but Christian democracy is not what animates Gaullists, and it's not really what animates either of the two principal conservative parties in Poland. So I think it's important to see, as I mentioned earlier, there are many tributaries and currents that irrigate conservatism across the globe.
Well, that is a very useful utterance, because we have a question which says, what is the difference between conservatism and Christian democracy? Are they compatible political allies? At least you have given some indication that there's a historical difference between them and a difference of approach. It may be that we should ask the question whether they are allies. I don't know whether anybody has a view on this. No.
I'd say more allies than conservatives and national Bolsheviks, for the sake of argument.
Excellent. Well, that answers the question.
I could have said that, Michael.
Yes. Let me just say a few things on my own part, because I think this question of what creates this alliance that we automatically feel across the Anglosphere has something to do, in my way of thinking, with the common law tradition. The fact that for us, institutions and the law itself are built from below and not imposed from above. And I think this is something that we do share, the British share with the Americans and with the Canadians and the Australians. And it is something which, of course, is not there for the most part in Europe. And this was pointed out by Hayek, who Rich wisely referred to, as one of the distinguishing features of our tradition, namely that we have law, others have legislation. And what socialists try to do is to replace law with legislation. And I think there is perhaps something there that we conservatives can unite around across frontiers. But
which makes it very difficult, I think, for conservatives right now because of the language of human rights, which we take up strongly when we talk about oppression in somewhere like Russia or China, but which we find is used against us constantly when it becomes justiciable through courts on the continent. Because the common law tradition is a perfectly different one from the human rights tradition. And yet, in modern political rhetoric, if you start attacking the human rights tradition, people think you don't care about human freedom and so on. So it's a really quite a conundrum. And I've noticed that in Britain, people are getting more and more worried about human rights because they see what actually happens in the European Court of Human Rights and how that percolates through. And so you still feel a bit bad if you say, oh, I don't like this human rights, because it sounds wrong. But it is a reality. There's a fundamental clash of philosophy and legal systems between our own and that which dominates the continent.
Well, obviously, this is a key characteristic of the American system, is decentralization, and it's to the states, and then also, more importantly, to civil society. And both of these are really under threat at the moment. The central state has steadily been aggrandized, and there's been created an administrative state that's increasingly lawless. The Obamacare, the healthcare legislation, the phrase "the secretary shall" appears dozens and dozens and dozens of times, which is just the way of the legislature saying the Secretary of Health and Human Services is going to make up this law as she or he goes along. And even with that enormous leeway, the President of the United States has actually just changed the law unilaterally on several hugely important measures. So you see an administrative state sort of spinning free of the constraints of the constitutional system and self-government as it's supposed to be conceived. And the founders, of course, had a dual view in America of human nature. On the one hand, if men were angels, you would need no government. They're not. We need a government. But on the other hand, they're capable of self-government, but they need to be virtuous. There needs to be a robust civil society to buttress the government. And just you are seeing in America, it's been true among the lower classes for a long time. It's working its way up to the working class, an erosion of those virtues and those institutions of civil society, most importantly, the family. And if there's one thing that depresses me, Roger, that is the thing that I'm most despairing about, is whether that destruction of that institution can ever be undone.
Well, that is a gloomy thought. But I think I want to move on, actually, towards the question of freedom. Charles, you said that Mrs. Thatcher was famous for at a certain point saying that for the first time in our lifetime, freedom is on the offensive. And I think that is a very interesting thought. What exactly is the place of freedom in the conservative philosophy as a whole? Rich has referred to the joy that we experience in receiving a space in which to conduct our lives, and that's part of freedom, obviously. Michael referred to the Kant's crooked timber of humanity, the fact that we have to live with all varieties of things and create a political order which accepts that variety. And I think that's all very true, but does this amount to making freedom absolutely fundamental, or just one of the byproducts of our respect for tradition and our respect for social order? Charles, yes, what would you?
No, I think the conservative idea of freedom would be that it is innate in human beings that they have the desire for freedom. However, it would be different from a purely liberal idea, because it would be very based on the notion that this had to be grounded in a institutional structure and in a rule of law. Otherwise, it can't get useful expression. And the freedom of one person just becomes a sort of way of fighting another. So I think that it would be seen as natural, but nevertheless also historical and political.
Right, so Charles, you say freedom for the conservatives is both natural and historical, and that is rather a useful way of putting it. Michael, would you like to add anything to that or subtract anything from it?
I think that Rousseau said man is born free and everywhere in chains. But I think it's actually the case that we develop into a state where we can exercise freedom. And I think that it's important to recognize that we shouldn't expect children to be able to exercise sovereign freedom. And there are reasons why we have schools and why healthy societies inculcate a respect for parents. And that is because, in order to be able to exercise freedom, you need to develop a strength of character and an appreciation for the virtues that society celebrates. And there's a very strong tradition in Renaissance thinking, the Republican thinking, the idea that before you can exercise the freedoms, which include, for example, the freedom to choose your rulers, that you need to have that understanding of what virtue is. And I think one of the purposes of education, as well as giving people the qualifications that they might need in order to have an economically successful life, is to help to inculcate those virtues that people can exercise freedom responsibly. Because freedom is not being a slave to passions. Freedom is not allowing sensual appetites to overwhelm you, and freedom certainly isn't imposing yourself on others and expecting them to subsidize every choice that you make. Freedom is best understood by conservatives in the context of virtue and culture and character and civilization.
That is a wonderful description of a certain kind of freedom. Is that the kind of freedom that we conservatives are aiming at, Rich?
Yeah, I think so. We want liberty, ordered liberty. And again, the American founders had an equal appreciation for liberty and order. And I think, Charles, one real life example we had over the last decade so of making too much of the innate desire for liberty, which is very real and we all feel, was the Bush administration's freedom doctrine, which simplified this extremely. And Bush seemed to conclude just because freedom is a desire of the human heart, that there are no other desires of the human heart that are undesirable. You know, the great sociologist Samuel Huntington said, "It is human to hate." And that's another part of the human heart. So the part of the theory, the theoretical underpinning of the Iraq War is you cut off the head of the beast in Baghdad, and then freedom naturally springs up from that. Well, it doesn't unless you have the institutional structure to do it, unless you have the cultural predicates, unless you have the cultural habits. And those things are extremely difficult to create on the fly. They're created in places like this over centuries. And that was something that was missed, and we paid a dear price for it.
Right. Well, those are three extremely interesting attempts to give us the conservative concept of freedom. Now we're advancing towards the end of this session and towards the drink that you're all longing for. I have to ask a question in a short while. This question is about freedom, and it was dictated to me by the Politburo. I have no choice in the matter. And it may or may not seem to you to relate to all the thoughts that have been on the panel. I haven't really got very many things on the iPad, but by way of light relief, which I will allow only 20 seconds to respond to from all three panelists, here is a question. Who is more conservative, David Cameron or Boris Johnson? 20 seconds, Charles.
Oh.
Exactly. That's enough.
Is that my answer? Well, I'm going to defend David Cameron, because I think, because he needs more defense, Boris getting all the applause. I think David Cameron is basically conservative and suffers, unfortunately, as some people who went to my school does, from embarrassment about something he doesn't need to be embarrassed about. And he is instinctively conservative, and he's good at it, and whenever he does that, he does it well. So I think he is a proper conservative who needs, to use a fashionable phrase, a nudge.
Excellent. Rich, you don't have to answer this question because you might feel it's...
Yeah, I'm wholly unsuited to answering this question. I'm on foreign soil, so I just want to make friends with everyone, Roger,
yes.
so I'll pass.
And I think, Michael, it would be a bad career move for you. So I shall just endorse what Charles said and move on.
I'm happy to try.
Well, if you would like to add anything.
It goes to, I hope, what I was saying at the beginning about not wanting to impose a single purity test. You can be a very good conservative in different ways. And, in some respects, David is the Apollonian and Boris is the Dionysiac, and both of them together, work. The other thing that I would say is that if we were living in the 18th century, which for many of us would be a very attractive thing to be able to do. If we were to ask the question, who's the better Conservative, Samuel Johnson or Edmund Burke? Could we answer that question? And Boris is a bit like Samuel Johnson, the great conversationalist, the literary figure, man with great appetites. And David is like Edmund Burke. He is a statesman who has a strong streak of common sense, an attachment to justice, a belief that what makes an individual political act wise is circumstance. And I think in that sense, both of them exemplify different Conservative traditions. And I have to say that in his instincts, in his automatic reaction to political events, in this conversation, David Cameron is an exemplary Conservative.
Well, that was a wonderful encomium. I hope he rewards you for it. An awful lot was left out, but still, that's very good. And of course, we now are in a position to confront this great question, which is just, should freedom within the rule of law be the guiding principle of modern conservatism? I want to say just a couple of things before you attempt to answer that. It may be that you think that there shouldn't be only one guiding principle of modern conservatism, or it may be that you think that really it is good to have one guiding principle, and if it were to be that one, that would be, if there were to be one, that would be it. I think we should take the question in the second sense, that if we were to look for a guiding principle, that would be it. But of course we know that there's a lot more to conservatism, as everybody has made clear to us. And I would like to reinforce something that Rich said, that behind conservatism there is an attitude which involves old-fashioned virtues, modesty, gratitude, reverence and joy. I would add another one, and a greater one to those, which is love. And my experience, the philosophies that I had to absorb in my university career from the left were philosophies of hate. And I learnt to respond to them by looking around myself for the things that I could love. And of course, among those things, our country was all important. And I have to say, Michael, that I have revised my opinion about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I've ceased to try to restore it. I do recognize that the nation-state is the proper object of one's attachment in the end. And I think this search for the thing that we love is obviously something that we're all in this conference engaged in. But the real question that we have to answer now is whether, in order to present that thing to the world, whether freedom within the rule of law is the way to do it. So a yes or no answer on your iPads to this, and then the day will be over. Do I get the answer up here? Or?
How can they disagree with that?
There it is.
There's a gallant people who don't agree.
So there you are. Yes is the answer. And I take that to be an affirmation of everything that's been said today and a vindication of the fact that we were invited to say it. So thank you very much, and thank you for the speakers.
Thank you very much, Roger. The very final part of today is, I've asked John O'Sullivan, who helped to found the Centre for Policy Studies 40 years ago, just to say a few words about today.
Well, thank you very much. And let me say that when Tim asked me if I would just make a few concluding remarks, and by the way, there will be a very few concluding remarks because I too want the drink that we're all looking forward to. But I was glad to do so for the two reasons. The first is that having written a piece about the early origins and success of the Centre for Policy Studies the other day, I wanted to make absolutely plain that what we have seen today is a tremendous example of an organization that has continued to evolve brilliantly and respond to all the changing issues of British politics and indeed of world politics. I think the first thing of all for a conservative to do is to state the obvious. And the obvious is that this conference has been an enormous success from the moment it began until a few moments ago. And I think we're all grateful for that. And we all express joy in it, Rich, too. And the second thing is to say that the Centre for Policy Studies has now established itself, it seems to me, as, well, the main, not the sole, but the main body representing conservative classical liberalism in this country, because the conservative tradition, of course, has absorbed the liberal tradition in Britain. And that tradition continues to give solutions and responses to the great issues of the day. I think that when we're in this hall, we feel this very strongly. And this is a more than national question. The liberal tradition and the British tradition are more or less the same thing. But this has been an international conference in a way that it would not have been in 1974. There were international liberal organizations then, but not to the same extent as we have seen today, in which distinguished people from every walk of life in all 5 continents have come forward and given persuasive and interesting solutions to the issues of the day. I would therefore say, with John Howard, that we can feel tremendous confidence, even though the issues have been faced and the hard truths have been accepted. We can feel tremendous confidence that the cultural resources of English liberalism and English and classical liberalism have not been exhausted. They continue to generate solutions to our problems. And my second reason for being, and last reason for being glad that Tim asked me, is that I can say what Tim Knox and Maurice Saatchi can't say for themselves, which is that they have managed to revive, create, spread and expand a very important institution. And today at this conference, they have demonstrated that with their optimism and drive or innovation, if I can use the non-conservative word, they have demonstrated that this is an organization that we can look forward to the next few years with the same kind of confidence in very different circumstances to the situation that those of us who in 1974 rallied around Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph at the Centre for Policy Studies then felt, although it seemed to all other observers that our confidence and our optimism were misplaced. I think today we can say our confidence and optimism in Maurice and Tim is very, very securely rooted indeed, and that we can thank them for this occasion, and I hope for many future occasions to come. Thank you.